Welcome back to the Big Tire Garage. Today's job is all about plumbing in a turbo, or in this case, we're going to be plumbing in 2 turbos. Now, the vehicle that these are going on is my 1960 C10 PreRunner, or at least I think it's a 60. It's like 3 different trucks all mixed up to put into one, and it's all sitting on an 03 Silverado chassis with long travel suspension. Now, this truck has a date with a dyno, so I really want to get this thing done. And the first step in doing that is getting all the plumbing done for these turbos. So that's what this video is going to be all about. Everything from the hot side to the cold side, intercoolers, waste gates, blow-off valves, and lastly, the exhaust. We're going to cover it all right here in this video. But first, let's grab ourselves a cup of coffee. Now, my original plan before I put this front sheet metal on was to have the turbos just basically mounted right here at the end of these front upswept headers. But that is not going to work because I need to fit a radiator and an intercooler in there. And if you have a turbo coming forward like that, I'm gonna have to basically carve up all of this front sheet metal, and the turbo would basically be sticking out the front of the hood. And it might look a little weird, but I had a better idea anyway. And that idea was to get the turbos sticking through the hood of the truck. I just think that would look so cool. So the fact that I can't put the turbos at the front of those headers, it's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. And it's gonna allow me to push them up through the hood, which is kind of what I always wanted to do in the long run anyway. So my plan now is to start working on that. I think that'll be the first step, is basically figuring out where the turbos are gonna go, and then we can start welding up some clamps. Oh gosh, I should probably also attach this hood at some point in time, where it's actually gonna sit. Ah! Good thing it's patinaed. I have 2 different sets of 180-degree bends that I'm playing with here, both from Vibrant Performance. And what I want to do is just basically figure out which one is going to stick the turbo up through the hood the right amount. I don't want the entire turbo sticking out through the hood because then I'd have to deal with all of the exhaust on the backside. But I do want basically just sort of half of the turbo, basically half of that compressor housing sticking up through the hood, and I think it'll look really, really good. I ended up going with the smaller of the 2 180 bends, and then all I got to do is weld on all of the V-band clamps to make it bolt onto both the header and the adapter to adapt the exhaust pipe over to the bottom of the turbo, and then we can install it and see what it looks like. Good. Step one in plumbing up this particular turbocharger system is going to be half of our hot side piping. Now, hot side refers to everything that has to do with the exhaust. So what we have right here is this tight little 180 that comes up back over here. The turbocharger is mounted right here. I have my externally mounted wastegate off to the side, and this will feed the turbine housing, which is half of a turbocharger. Now, this would be a great time to actually sit down and talk about how does a turbocharger actually add power to an engine. This is a turbocharger. Now, a turbocharger is a type of forced induction. Now, forced induction means that we are essentially changing how the engine breathes. We'll often break engines down into two categories: naturally aspirated and forced inducted. So naturally aspirated engines is just the engine in your everyday car or an engine without a turbocharger or supercharger on it. What that means is it's basically essentially relying on the vacuum that's created inside the engine during the intake stroke of the pistons to basically pull air into the engine. It's breathing it in. With forced induction, we're changing that process. We're not just relying on the vacuum of the engine to draw the atmosphere in. We're actually going to shove as much air into the engine as we can. Now, the way a turbocharger does that is actually pretty unique. A turbocharger has two halves to it. We have a turbine housing on this side, and that is essentially the exhaust side or hot side of the turbo. And then on this side, we have the compressor housing. This is essentially the intake air, or often referred to as cold side of the turbo. As the exhaust leaves your engine, it's going to travel up through the bottom flange on the turbocharger, and then when it's inside the turbine housing, it's going to spin a set of fan blades inside of here. It's basically just spinning those around. The faster the exhaust exits the engine, the faster these blades are going to spin. If you want an analogy for that, think of a water wheel as a waterfall falls over a cliff. It hits the blades on the water wheel and it spins the water wheel. The exhaust is doing the exact same thing to the blades inside the turbine housing. Now, those blades are attached by a shaft that travels through the center of the turbo to another set of blades inside the compressor housing. Now, in this compressor housing, the blades get spun at the same speed as the blades on the exhaust side. The faster the blades spin on the exhaust side, the faster the blades are going to spin on the compressor side. And what that's going to do is it's going to draw air into the compressor housing of the turbocharger, and then it's going to force it down into the engine. By forcing the air into the engine, we are compressing it. When you compress air, it takes up less volume. So if you can imagine inside your engine on a normal day without any type of forced induction, maybe the cylinder holds this much air. You add fuel to this much air, and therefore the balance is perfect. It ignites, and that's where you make power. If we can take this much air and compress it down into a much smaller size, that means that now there's all this other room around that air that used to be there. So that means we can fit more air. We can pack more air in. Once we pack more air in, then we can add more fuel. And that is the basic science to building power inside an internal combustion engine. If you can get more air into the cylinder, that means you can get more fuel into the cylinder, and that means you can make more power. That's essentially how a turbocharger works. Now, there are some drawbacks to a turbocharger. The first one being heat. As you're utilizing this spent exhaust gas inside this turbine housing, we can build a lot of heat right here on the turbo. That heat can then get transferred over into the cold side or intake side of the turbo. So the higher your EGTs get, there is a chance that your intake air temperatures will rise as well, just because of how close these two items are together. Now, there's ways to deal with that. We're going to talk about that a little later on. There's also what's referred to as turbo lag. Now, turbo lag is that small couple of seconds that it takes for the power that you're wanting out of the engine, so you stepped on the gas and you want the power, that exhaust is going to take a couple of seconds to spin up the blades inside the turbine housing, to then spin up the blades in the compressor housing and force the more air that you need inside the engine. So the power band for a turbocharged engine does not come on as fast as other types of forced induction. But the benefit of a turbocharger is simple. You can fit a turbocharger on any internal combustion engine, because as long as that engine has an exhaust and an intake, which they all do, you can add a turbocharger to it. First step that I'm going to be doing is focusing on all the hot side piping of this turbocharger setup. So that means that I'm going to be dealing with the exhaust outlets of the actual turbine housing, as well as some additional items that we need to add to our engine to control the boost that this turbo makes. Whenever you build a turbocharged engine, you need to control the amount of boost or pressure that we're adding to the cylinder. Too much pressure, and if your engine is not built to handle that amount of boost, you can have mechanical part failure. Now, I am controlling my engine using two mechanical wastegates. Now, the wastegate will bleed off the exhaust before it enters into the turbocharger to control the amount of boost. Now, the way it does it, there's a small valve in the bottom of the wastegate, and then on the head or top of the wastegate is a diaphragm and a spring. The amount of pressure that this spring uses to keep the diaphragm closed and the valve closed, that's what sets our boost level. You can get the springs in different sizes and different pressures. I'm running a 10-pound spring in both of my wastegates. There's going to be a small hose that comes off of the turbocharger outlet, and it's going to come down to the bottom side of the diaphragm on my wastegate. What will happen is, as that boost pressure increases in the engine and gets above that 10 psi or 10 pounds of boost, that pressure will push on the diaphragm. It'll overcome the 10 pounds of spring pressure that's pushing down on the diaphragm, and that will cause this valve in the bottom to open. When it opens, the exhaust will no longer bypass the wastegate and go into the turbocharger. The exhaust gas will start to come out the wastegate and out the additional exhaust pipe, therefore bleeding off exhaust from the turbocharger, causing it to slow down and therefore less boost. Now, there are other ways to control boost inside an engine. There's electronic boost controllers and more complicated ways, but this is the easiest way to do it, and I actually like it because it allows me to run that secondary exhaust pipe out the back. Now, in the future, if I wanted to add more boost to my engine, all I simply have to do is unbolt that top or head of this wastegate and change it to a stronger spring. Likewise, if I want to lower the amount of boost, I just change to a lighter spring. It's a very simple and effective way to control boost inside a forced inducted engine. With the hot side of my turbo piping done, I'm going to move to the cold side or intake side. Now, it's going to start by modifying my 102 millimeter throttle body with a Vibrant Performance HD clamp. Now there's lots of ways to connect your boost tubes together, as well as how to connect boost tubes to things like your throttle body or your intercooler. The most popular is honestly a silicone boot and a T-clamp. You do need to make sure that if you're going to use a silicone boot, that you do a couple things. Number one, the tube has to have a ridge rolled in it, and you need to make sure that that silicone boot is designed for pressure. There's lots of silicone boots out there that are just designed for basically air intake tubes, and when you put boost through them, they will fail. I'm using Vibrant Performance HD clamps. Now, I absolutely love these clamps because they are a machined billet unit that basically works as two weldments and then a clamp that holds everything together. It's an incredibly good look. It gives the boost tube a very, very professional finished look when it's all said and done. The pinless design makes it very easy to take apart. You simply have to push on the pin, lift up, open the clamp, and then you can take it off and then disconnect the tubes. You have two weldments that weld onto either boost tubes or whatever you're attaching it to. An O-ring then goes in these grooves, and then this piece slides over those two O-rings, and then you just put the clamp over it and it holds it together. It allows for a subtle amount of movement inside the boost tubes, which is great because there is going to be movement as the pressure increases as well as the engine rocks. But also it makes it quick and easy to disconnect the boost tubes without any tools. And it's going to start right at the throttle body. Feature that I absolutely have to keep on this truck is the fact that this front grille section had a tree growing through it when we pulled this truck out of the field, and I want to keep it. I do have to trim it to make the intercooler fit behind it, but I want to keep that tree sticking through the grille because I just think it looks cool. So now we're going to work on the cold side of the turbochargers, which means the piping that has to come from the compressor outlet, which is right here. And then it has to go through this right here, which is an air-to-air intercooler. Now that intercooler is fed from both sides. I got this 2-in-1 intercooler, and then it comes out the top. It's going to be tight to make the turn into this HD clamp here, but the nice thing is Vibrant offers these HD clamps with an integrated transition in them. So the actual HD clamp that I'm going to be welding to the pipe on this side steps this down from a 4-inch to a 3.5, and then I'm going to be welding a 3.5-inch HD clamp onto the top of this intercooler. I could push this intercooler forward a little bit if I wanted to, but I've already committed to the fact that I'm running a rear-mounted radiator in this truck, so there's really no benefit in doing that. What I have to do right now is essentially just basically connect the dots. So this means that we have to connect from that that compressor outlet down to the side of the intercooler, and for that, I just got a whole bunch of different aluminum bends. Now, there's different ways you could do this. You could do a whole bunch of couplers. That's one option to do it. But I'm going to try and do it with one straight pipe with just a coupler at either end. So my plan here is to have an HD clamp down here at the intercooler. Right now I've got this silicone boot on here, but I'm going to take that off, replace it with an HD clamp. I'll have this 90. This is a tight 90 that Vibrant offers, which really is the only way to make this happen. If you had to do a long swooping 90, I think I'd end up over here in this control arm. But the plan right now is to run this incredibly tight 90 right out of here. And then we'll essentially probably trim this really short right here, and then another sort of swooping 90 that will end up lined up perfectly with that compressor outlet. and then that will just come down with like maybe a 45 or a 60 to line up over it. Honestly, the best way to do this is to just tack the tubes together as you go, test fit them, make sure everything looks good, and then weld it when you know it's going to fit into the system. An intercooler is an important part of any forced inducted engine because it's going to remove the additional heat that's been added to the intake charge as we compress the air. We don't want hot air entering into the cylinder. We want the air that goes into the engine to be as cool as possible. And the best way to do that, or in this case, the easiest way to do that for my project, is with an air-to-air intercooler. Now, an air-to-air intercooler works very similar to the radiator in your car. The air from the turbocharger is going to go in one side of the intercooler and it's going to travel across the intercooler core. That core is going to use the ambient air that's traveling from the grill of the vehicle, or maybe some fans pushing air across it, to help dissipate the heat before the compressed air leaves the opposite side. Intercoolers are sized based on how much air you plan to push through the motor. That's why you'll see diesel engines have huge intercoolers on the front of them because they're pushing a lot of air through those engines, whereas small four-cylinder import cars, which is what this intercooler came off of, they run a lot smaller intercoolers because they're moving less air across it. Now, there are other ways to cool off that intake charge. There's air-to-water intercoolers, there's chiller boxes, and you'll see those used a lot on road race cars or drag race cars. But when it comes to something like a twin-turbo 60 C10 pickup truck, the easiest way to deal with that increased intake air temperature is with an air-to-air intercooler. One issue that I did find right now is I've got the core support set on here and everything's centered, but obviously from the factory, the motor is offset slightly towards the passenger side. That's pretty common in a lot of modern vehicles. People sometimes think that the engines are always centered in the engine bay, but quite often they're offset to one side. And in this case, it's offset to the passenger side. So my intercooler opening here doesn't line up perfectly with my air intake, which is no problem. It just means that this is going to be a little bit more of a complicated transition to get from the top of this into the air inlet right here. But we'll take care of that in a second. Right now, I want to go ahead and reinstall everything on the front of the motor. And that way I can make sure that I have clearance for everything, for all the boost tubes to get around everything. Because I got a water pump, I got a power steering pump, I got an alternator, I have all that kind of stuff. So I want to get all that stuff on first, and then I can go ahead and basically finish up all of these turbo pipes because I want to make sure that everything will fit. Last thing I want to do is build a turbo pipe and then end up with it hitting something silly like an alternator. So I'm going to assemble the front of the motor and then go from there. My plan to add an HD clamp to the top of the intercooler is not going to work. There's just no room for it and this elbow transition to fit. It took a lot of trimming and a lot of work to get this elbow to even line up with the intake. So much so that I was nervous that even just welding it outside of the truck would cause it to get out of position. So I made sure to put a lot of pretty heavy tacks on this upper elbow before I pulled it out of the truck to weld it on the bench. last item that we need to make provisions for on our cold side turbo piping is for this. Now, this is a blow-off valve. Now, the blow-off valve's job is actually very important. You can imagine you're driving this truck maybe through the desert, and you're just flying through the dunes, and you got the throttle wide open, the turbos are spooling up, and they're building boost, and stuffing all that air into the engine, and you're jamming a bunch of fuel in there and making a bunch of power, and then you let off the throttle blade slams shut. Well, the turbos are still spinning, and they're still building boost, and all that pressure then is basically trapped. It's trapped inside all of our cold side boost tubes, and it's trapped inside our intercooler. And the last thing we want is for that pressure to do one of two things. One, could cause a failure in that cold side piping or intercooler, or it could actually cause the throttle blade to start open back up because the pressure is pushing on the throttle blade. Well, that is what a blow-off valve is for. The blow-off valve will basically remain closed until that excessive pressure builds up inside the cold side, and then the valve will open up and it will let that pressure out. You'll sometimes hear these things make a very distinctive sound on a turbocharged vehicle, and especially these aftermarket ones, they're actually designed to make sound. So when you let out the throttle, you hear like a shoosh. That's the blow-off valve, and you can actually order them to make a lot of sound. This is what's often referred to as an RFL blow-off valve, or a real freaking loud one. So it's designed to make that sound. So that's why you buy it, is to basically make that sound. So we have to make a little, we have a little pipe that's been welded onto our intake, and it just attaches with a small band clamp, and then we're done. So now what I'm gonna do is completely disassemble everything. I'm gonna basically pull the turbos off, pull the headers off, pull all the piping off, go through, check all my welds, make sure everything is good, and then I can start assembling everything for the last time. I'm also going to paint all my boost tubes. I'm going to paint my intercooler because I don't like it shiny aluminum. I want it flat black. So I'm going to paint those items when I put them all in, and then this turbo piping video will be done. When it's all reassembled, I'll walk you through how the entire system works, front to back, one last time. Let's take a break from the action right now and have a little conversation about some tools that will make your life a lot easier, as well as some welding tips for when you're doing a project like this. When you're dealing with turbo piping, you're going to be doing a lot of TIG welding. So you want to get yourself a nice quality TIG welder that you're comfortable using. You also want to get a nice torch. I like the CK Flex Lock torch because the head is adjustable. On that Flex Lock torch, I like to install a clear cup or a Pyrex cup and a gas diffuser, just because it makes it a lot easier to see the weld bead, especially when you're working around in tight spaces. You'll want to have some type of bandsaw, because that's going to be the best way to cut the stainless as well as cut all of the aluminum. The last thing you want to do is be running this stainless through a chop saw, because the aggressive blade that cuts through that steel, it's actually going to cause the chromium to boil out of the stainless, and when you weld it, it's going to brown out on you just because of the heat that you've already introduced into that pipe. So either a benchtop bandsaw or a horizontal bandsaw is ideal, because then you can get nice straight cuts. You want a deburring tool, especially for the aluminum. You want to basically get inside all of the aluminum pipes, run that deburring tool around the inside to get the leftover chunks of aluminum that are going to be inside. You don't want those feeding into your engine when you first fire it up. You're going to be doing some grinding, so it's a good idea to get yourself some aluminum specific flap wheels, along with some that are designed for steel. Remember, the goal here is to not put a lot of heat into either the aluminum piping or the stainless steel exhaust piping. So be very gentle when you are basically grinding or finishing out the edges of those pipes. Scotch-Brite will be your friend, as well as a bottle of acetone, because you're going to be cleaning every single joint before you TIG weld it. So get yourself a box of green Scotch-Brite and a whole bunch of acetone. You're going to be sharpening your tungsten a lot, so go ahead and get if you don't have a tungsten sharpener, this is your excuse to go buy one, because at this point in time, it's best to have it. Based on all the TIG welding that you're going to have to do, you're going to want to be sharpening that tungsten on a regular basis. As for welding tips, when it comes to stainless, the key to stainless is just an incredibly short arc length. So you want to get that tungsten as close to the joint as possible. That's where the Pyrex cup really comes into play. So you can actually see through the cup and see the end of the tungsten. You basically want that tungsten just licking the edge of the molten puddle as you weld. And at the same time, if you are going to be using filler material to basically add into the area, if you have a little burn back spot on the pipes, make sure that that filler stays inside that gas cloud for the entire time you're welding. Don't add a little bit of filler and take it out, or the filler will become contaminated. That's also what causes those stainless welds to gray out in the long run. But remember, for stainless, it's all about that incredibly short arc length. Now, when it comes to welding the aluminum, this is where it gets a little bit trickier. You don't need to worry so much about having a short arc length, but you do need to remember that the longer you stretch that arc length back, the fatter the molten puddle is going to try to get. And when you're doing a butt joint on piping, if you pull that torch back too far, there's a chance that you'll basically burn off that edge material. You really want to spend a lot of time playing with the pedal when you're welding aluminum. Also make sure, just like with the stainless, make sure that filler material stays inside that gas cloud that's coming out of that torch, because if you pull it out and it basically, I call it bubble gums up, you'll see it at the end of the TIG rod. Just throw that TIG rod out and grab another one, because you don't want to basically feed that bubble gum or that contaminated aluminum into the weld. That's where you'll get that peppering or blacking out of that aluminum weld, and that's just basically contamination in that weld. Now, we can't talk about welding without talking about probably the most important thing, and that is the base material. You can have the best welder in the world being handled by one of the most proficient welders in the world with some of the cleanest tungsten and the best torch setup and everything prepped right and ready to weld. And if the base material is not the best, you're going to have a contaminated weld. I used all vibrant piping for all of this. So when it came to the pipes and the HD clamps and all the stainless, I knew that I was going to have high quality material to weld to. So I didn't have to worry about any of those welds being contaminated. But I did have to weld some of the HD clamps onto items that had, we'll say, questionable base material. So the intercooler, the turbocharger outlets, things like that. That cast aluminum that those two items are made out of, it's probably not as pure as the vibrant aluminum. And when that happens, you're going to get some of that black peppering inside the weld. There's really nothing you can do about it, because of the fact that the problem has nothing to do with your weld. It has nothing to do with the gas coverage. It has everything to do with the fact that I'm basically melting cast aluminum that's probably not as pure as the aluminum pipe that I'm welding it to. So the best thing there is just take your time, really pay attention to it, try to do your best, but don't be frustrated if when you're welding high quality, vibrant HD clamps onto an overseas turbocharger housing outlet and you end up with some of that black peppered spots on there. It's not your fault. You didn't make the cast housing. There's nothing you can do about it. All right, so now everything has been reassembled underneath, well, through kind of around the hood on the C10 PreRunner. So now let's just go ahead and take a quick walkthrough on how all this turbo piping works now that it's all fully assembled. So obviously it all starts right here at the exhaust header. So all the exhaust is leaving through this header right here, coming up through this stainless 180 bend. Right here, we have our mechanical wastegate, and right now it has a 10-pound spring in it. So that's 10 pounds of boost. So as you can see, we have a vacuum line right here. So the way this works is the spring is pushing down on the plunger, and that is a 10-pound spring. This vacuum line comes over here and is teed off the compressor outlet. So when 10 pounds of pressure comes through here and pushes on this side of our wastegate, it's going to open the valve up. That's going to allow the exhaust fluid to basically divert before the turbocharger and exit out through the side of the hood in this case. But until that happens, exhaust gas is coming up through here into our turbine housing right here. So inside this turbine housing, as we showed you before, going through the blades inside the turbo housing, starts to spin up the turbo, and then it exhausts down through this tailpipe right here with our O2 sensor right here. Now I mentioned before that there was a shaft connecting the the turbine housing to the compressor housing, and inside that shaft there's some bearings, so we had to add an oil feed. So this is a -4 oil feed. This comes, basically it's fed from the engine. There's one for each turbo. The nice thing with the LS is there's actually a very easy place to tap into the LS to feed these turbos. I'll show you where that is underneath. And then underneath, there is a drain in there. It's hard to see, but there's a -10 drain that goes down all the way down to the oil pan. So pressurized oil comes in up here, lubricates the bearings, then goes out. Okay, so that's what spins the turbo. The same time, air is being pulled in through this beautiful vibrant air filter, and it's entering the compressor housing. The air is then compressed right here, comes down through our first boost tube, which is in here. That boost tube comes down, goes by the exhaust over here, comes around, goes into the bottom of our intercooler right here, comes up through the intercooler, and then goes into the intake right here. Right here is our blow-off valve that we talked about before. This blow-off valve is just making sure that the pressure inside here does not get excessive. The same way that the boost pressure here is being used on the spring pressure on the blow-off valve, this boost pressure is doing the exact same thing. So there's a boost pressure feed on top of the blow-off valve. There's also a boost pressure feed that goes back, all the way back to our fuel pressure regulator. That way, once the fuel pressure regulator is set to the pressure that we want, as boost increases, the fuel pressure will increase as well to match the boost. So that's a pressure sensitive fuel pressure regulator, and that line will allow it to basically feed on there. So that is how all that turbo piping works together to make this system work. It is a very complicated job to add some turbos or a single turbo to your engine, but you gotta admit, when it's all said and done, it looks pretty cool and sounds even better. Spicy! I love it. Now, we take it to the dyno.